It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion this evening. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people upon whose land we meet, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. So thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight's panel discussion is just one of many events in the Science Festival, part of the National Science Week, and so I'd encourage you all to go online and look up the many events, and I'll do a special plug for Blood, Attract and Repel, which is part exhibition, part experiment, pop-up gallery that we've put up in the university to really bring about the collision of art and science to ignite creativity. So it's one of my pet projects, and I'll give it a plug here. My own research has been in global health in malaria, and I've been particularly focused on the developing world, and I'm particularly interested in the success of the Millennium Development Goals. And of course, Goal 1 was about eradicating poverty and hunger by bringing together many NGOs, governments and private-public partnerships to achieve such a goal. But we know that progress is not exactly what we would like. Hunger has been reduced by about up to 50%, but we're still seeing 800 million people undernourished, and 100 million of those are children under 5. The problem still exists. So the question, how do we feed the world, is very relevant. So tonight's panel is going to be moderated by Uma Qatari, and Uma's joined us as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow here at the University of Melbourne, but she also holds an appointment at the University of Manchester as Professor of Migration and Post-Colonial Studies. She's also the founder of the Manchester Migration Lab and Vice President of the European Association of Development Institutes. Uma visited Melbourne on sabbatical last year in the School of Geography, and we're delighted that she's decided to stay on with us. So I'll now hand over to Uma, and she can introduce the panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, and welcome to all of you who've come out on this actually very warm evening in Melbourne to participate in discussions around what's clearly a very urgent and pressing global challenge. You know, how do we ensure that everyone can meet their daily nutritional needs now and into the future? And as we know, millions of people continue to struggle every day to get enough food to meet their basic energy and nutrient requirements. And in that context, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which have just been approved and launched, the goal number 2 is to achieve zero hunger. So to end all forms of hunger and malnutrition by 2030. And as Professor Day mentioned, there have been many advances in achieving this over the last 2 decades, but over 800 million people are estimated to be chronically undernourished, and over 90 million children under the age of 5 are dangerously underweight. And these issues and the causes behind them have been debated and discussed, as I'm sure many of you know, amongst researchers and activists. And some people say they're a direct consequence of environmental degradation, of drought, loss of biodiversity. They're also related to issues around conflict, natural disasters, and social inequalities. So while we have that sort of hunger and malnutrition on the one hand, at the same time, some people in some countries, mostly in wealthy countries, generally eat too much and waste huge amounts of food. So today what we want to do is to discuss what are the causes of these interconnected problems of undernourishment and overconsumption, and also food shortage and food wastage. And importantly, how can science then, how can technology and society work together to solve them? So to discuss these issues, I'm absolutely delighted that we have an expert panel of researchers and activists researchers from the university, activists from non-profit sectors, to discuss how we might feed the world now and into the future, and to address some of the questions that you might have around promoting sustainable agriculture, for example, the role of technology in improving agricultural productivity, issues around food distribution. So we have on the panel, on my far left, Professor Herbert Kronzucker, who's Global Agricultural Researcher and Head of the School of Biosciences, University of Melbourne. Welcome. And then third from my left, Ronnie Khan, who's the founder and the CEO of the food rescue charity OzHarvest. And then Tony Ronaldo, Natural Resources Management Specialist at World Vision Australia. And Dr. Shona Candy, who's the Food and Urban Systems Researcher with the Victoria Eco Innovation Lab at the University of Melbourne. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming. Following the panel discussion, I'll open it up for questions and answers and comments from the audience, and we hope that you'll stay on afterwards and join us for a reception with vegetarian food provided by the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. And there's some displays and activities, and we hope that that will inspire some further conversations. So while you're all experts in your own individual fields, your research and your work in the broad field of, let's say, food security as the shorthand, I'm sure that you share many views, but perhaps you also have different perspectives on the causes of food insecurity and some of the solutions to feeding the world. So I want to start off by asking each of you just to spend 2 minutes, and I'm quite a fierce moderator, I have to tell you in advance. That's what we're like in Manchester, you see. So I want to give each of the panelists just 2 minutes to speak about your work and to summarize what for you are the key challenges, are the main challenges around feeding the world. So if we start with you, Professor Herbert.
Could I grab this?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thing here. It's always hard to be the first one up because you have to make a few introductory statements, of course, as well. The challenge of feeding 7.5 billion people on the planet is without a question one of the biggest challenges the human race is facing and has faced for some time. And it's probably also one of the most under-advertised challenges. We hear a lot about climate change. We hear a lot about infectious diseases. We hear occasional coverage of a hunger problem, of a food security problem, but we're not receiving nearly the attention that this issue deserves. I come to you from Canada. I was there for 16 years as a director of the Canadian Centre for World Hunger Research. And we brought together academics from various disciplines, from within my own, the biological sciences, from engineering, from environmental sciences, from medicine, public health, all to brainstorm about what needs to be done to feed the world. First, a little bit of a historical success story, and that is that we have been able to produce enough food through agricultural advances to, in principle, feed everybody on the planet to a sustainable level. You wanted me to identify one of the biggest issues that prevents us from doing this. Clearly, we have issues of social inequality and warfare that, in some cases, we can do very little about. But more fundamentally, there is a problem with furnishing enough food for everybody on the planet. Were everyone to live like we take for granted in places like Canada, the United States, or Australia, if you calculate the carrying capacity of Earth, in other words, how many human beings can live on the planet sustainably, just on food consumption and production alone, you come to the conclusion that no more than 2.5 billion people could be supported by the entire planet's capability to produce agricultural products. 2.5 billion were everyone to live the way we live. In other words, intensely consume meat and waste food to a very, very large extent. We have a food wastage problem of about 40% globally of that which is produced in the agricultural fields of the world that never makes it to the table. And the Australian lifestyle of consuming per capita about 100 kilograms of meat per year, that's the average, 100 kilograms of meat per year, would make it impossible for planet Earth to sustain food production for 7.5 billion. Agriculture currently occupies 33% of Earth's land mass, all of Earth's landmass, 33% is already agricultural land. And please consider that about 50% of Earth's land surface is completely unutilizable for agriculture. It's deserts, it's mountains, it's ice. You can't grow anything there. And most people don't realize, furthermore, that some 70% of all of the world's water consumption is in agriculture, and don't realize that a very large fraction, possibly as much as 50%, but certainly something in the order of 20 to 30% of all greenhouse gases are emitted in agriculture. So we need to rethink the agricultural space very, very carefully and very fundamentally if we are to sustainably feed 7.5 billion and growing. We expect 9.7 billion people by 2050.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Ronnie Khan, who's the founder and CEO of food rescue charity OzHarvest, and I suppose you'll be talking a bit about that wastage and overconsumption, what we can do about it.
Absolutely. So I focus primarily on Australia, although OzHarvest now does have global reach, and our advocacy and campaigning is about shifting and changing the Australian landscape, where within Australia 3 million people suffer from food security or food insecurity, of which 1 million of those are kids under the age of 15. So if you consider our extraordinary abundant country that has enough food for 60 million people, and yet 25 million people live in our country, and 3 million of them go hungry. So I think our biggest challenge is how you and me and all of us shift and change our behavior to stop the 40% of food that goes to waste. So first of all, we need to take responsibility and become aware and understand our role in the whole food supply chain. Because every single time we point a finger and say, it's the supermarkets, it's the producers, it's the manufacturers, we are all those people. And we need to understand how our role can shift and change that. Obviously, the bigger picture that Professor Herbert has shared and shown us is the global scale. But I think we each have a role to play, and that's what I'd like to share with all of you and discuss here tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tony, perhaps you can give us the perspective from World Vision Australia and in your particular role as natural resource specialist.
Thank you. So obviously hunger is multifaceted in many causes. In my particular area of work, one of the major concerns that I have is land degradation. And humans obtain 99.7% of their food calories from the land, and yet over 52% of the land used for agriculture is moderately to severely affected by land degradation. So to the degree possible, World Vision works with farmers and communities to restore degraded landscapes, and might be through implementing soil and water conservation measures, water harvesting, encouragement of natural regeneration of trees, and planting trees and grasses and legumes. Next slide. So that change occurred over a 2-year period when communities were mobilised to instead of continuously over-exploiting their landscape, to manage it in a sustainable way. Next slide. With the increase in improvement in vegetation and biodiversity, there are improvements in the microclimate, in soil fertility, in moisture retention, and so farmers' yields increase and their opportunities for income generation. In addition, both timber and non-timber forest products. So food supply and income have been increased, and also people's resilience increases because they're no longer reliant entirely on a single annual crop, which is dependent on rainfall. Next slide. So especially where you combine natural regeneration and tree planting with water harvesting, then water tables rise and are recharged over time. Then irrigation becomes possible, and farmers are able to switch from this dependency on one rain-fed crop per year, to which they're very, very vulnerable, to growing 2 to 3 high-value irrigated horticultural crops per year. So the dynamics completely changes. And then as farmers start to realise a surplus, we found it very critical to link farmers to markets and to help negotiating in good prices and developing mechanisms for getting their produce to the market. So it's a kind of stepwise combination of interventions, and it's helping to increase livestock production and crop yields and lifting living standards.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Sharon, if you talk about food and urban systems.
Yes, so my background and really the focus of my research is linking food availability to land and resource use, and also looking at the impacts of climate change, which can impact the food system in many, many ways. And I think it's really important to point out that climate change is not just about ice caps and polar bears, it's about food and water, and it's going to become increasingly, I suppose, drastic as the years go on. And the way we produce food now is really going to eat into the food we can produce in the future. So what we do now is really going to affect future generations. Now, cities are particularly vulnerable to food insecurity. We're now entering an unprecedented period in, I suppose, the history of humankind, what's called the urban age, where over 50% of the global population are now living in cities. In Australia, 83% of our population live in urban areas. And all of these people need to eat pretty much every day. Our recent project, the Foodprint Melbourne project, we worked out that in a city the size of Melbourne requires 15,000 tonnes of food every day to feed the city. So if you think about, we have to produce that food and we also have to transport it. So food production is under threat from climate change, and so is food distribution. If anyone remembers the scenes from the 2011 Brisbane floods, there were empty supermarket shelves because food couldn't get into the city. So our food is supplied in Australia from, I suppose, a number of areas throughout the country, and all of those are at risk themselves from land degradation, as was mentioned earlier, and also competition with other sectors. So in another piece of research, we modelled competition for water resources and tensions around water. Energy production uses a lot of water. This is going to become the competing human needs for energy and food are going to draw on an increasingly dwindling supply of natural resources. So if we really want to sort of securely feed our population, even in a country like Australia, which seemingly produces so much food, we really have to rethink our food system. We have to examine it, not just what we produce, how we produce it, but also what we consume. So it needs to come from both ends if we're going to find a happy medium in the middle.
Thank you. Perfect. Perfect timing and very interesting perspectives. I will open it up to the audience, but I just wanted to just push you a bit further, the panellists. You've talked a bit about what the problem is and what you individually see as some of the causes of that problem, of food insecurity, unequal access to food, to nutritious food. So before I push you to start thinking about some of the solutions, it seems to me that you know, some of you have talked about food shortage, whereas, for example, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, when he was studying famines, he said, well, there's not a shortage of food. The problem is the distribution of food. And since we all live in a global food system, you know, can we find national answers to something that is actually global? So I suppose there's two issues there. To think about the causes, is it, in a sense, as Herbert, you were saying, around sort of overpopulation, about the burden on the land, about new farming practices, you mentioned that as well. is it actually about the amount of food that's being produced, or is it much more about the distribution of that food globally?
Well, yeah, it is really all of the above. So when Amartya Sen talks about there being no shortage of food calories for the human population on the planet, he makes that statement based upon many, many, many decades of very successful agricultural research advances that have, for the biggest crops on the planet, we do a lot of work on rice in our own lab. That is the crop that feeds more than 3 billion people on the planet. Rice, wheat, and corn, those are the three biggies, and then comes potato. For all these big crops, yields have more than tripled over the past 50 years because of a not very visible, untiring, if you will, behind the background, where nobody's watching, research effort by agricultural scientists, by geneticists, by people who improve irrigation methods, pesticide manufacture, etc., etc. Without these successes having occurred, we would not even come anywhere near being capable of feeding even the current population of 7.5 billion at a reasonable caloric intake level. Amartya is right, of course, that there are distribution inequities that are absolutely abject. And I mean, this is the obvious conclusion from the realization that we as Australians or Canadians or North Americans or Central Europeans are consuming way more than our fair share. How can we do that? How can we consume more than our fair share? If the planet could only support, and you can show this kind of calculation stringently, 2.5 billion people globally with our eating habit, well, that means that 5 billion of the rest of us cannot get anything to eat. So our very lifestyle here is predicated upon inequity of distribution. So it's both. Amartya is right, but it's also absolutely true that without constant efforts through science to improve the world's agricultural capabilities, we would be in no place to feed the world.
Thank you. Ronnie, did you want to come in?
Well, I do want to comment because, as you mentioned, and as the whole organization of OzHarvest is predicated on the fact that we waste 40% of all food. And for those of you who don't know, on a daily basis, we collect food from over 3,000 food donors, and we deliver it to over 1,000 organizations, and we deliver the equivalent of 20 million meals a year. Now, that is food that would otherwise have gone to landfill. So we have to do something about the distribution and about our habit of, and the reasons that good food goes to waste. And one of them in the Western world is our need for perfect produce. And the whole notion now of imperfect and ugly fruit and vegetables that are being devalued because in order to make us buy them and to showcase that it exists, we're putting them in our supermarkets and on the shelves at a much cheaper price than beautiful fruit and vegetables. But it costs exactly the same amount of money to produce an ugly apple or banana as it does to produce a beautiful one. So somewhere along the way, we have to take responsibility for that. But, and that whole notion of distribution is one of the biggest challenges.
But you're saying it's partly around habit and lifestyle, and it's partly around the way in which the market works. And I'm sure you would agree it's partly about celebrity chefs and the incredible wastage of the ways in which people now feel that they should eat and consume. But I mean, how...
Food has become such a part of our entertainment life. So the whole value of food has been elevated to this glorious place that we want to watch people cooking, we want to deify our fabulous chefs, and then we do on some levels want to copy that, and so we see a chef making whatever it is with a recipe, and we rush out and buy those ingredients, which we may or may never use, or we may only use once. So there is something in the Western world's behavior, our overconsumption, but the challenge is greater because somebody might well ask, so if I don't eat my bananas here, how's it going to help someone starving in Africa? And that is another question.
I mean, Tony, from the other perspective, you spent 18 years working in Niger, is that right? I mean,
that's
what
correct.
kind of, I mean, that's sort of an area that's gone through, or a country that's gone through sort of huge underconsumption and sort of agricultural productivity that's gone up and down over the years.
Yes.
What do you see in relation to production and distribution as one of the
It's
key?
very interesting. So Niger is a landlocked country on the edge of the Sahara Desert in West Africa, and we lived there 17 years. And during that time, I was involved in famine relief 5 separate years, but even in so-called non-famine years, there's always a hunger period. One of the surprising things was, and we're really talking within national borders, perhaps some trade with Nigeria next door, even in the severest famines, when there was almost total crop failure across the country, there was food available if you could afford it. So the price would triple, even greater extent during food shortage periods, but it would be dirt cheap at harvest time. And it was always crushing when you finally did have a good year, and they weren't that frequent, that immediately at harvest time, people would be selling their grain. It was the main source of cash for them. They'd be selling their grain at rock bottom prices. And there might have been a cultural event on that. People, culturally, they're obliged to dress up and splurge out a little bit, so that they, in their minds, they had no choice. And for us, it was very, very critical to try to equip people with, help them with grain storage facilities and mechanisms for buffering those differences between the years.
But do you feel then that the work that you've been doing with World Vision is much more about encouraging subsistence agriculture? So we produce what we consume rather than enter into a market which is inevitably unequal. I mean, is that some of the work that you've been doing around subsistence?
That's very romantic, and I think a lot of aid agencies had that approach. If we could only get people to be self-sufficient, that's wonderful. What amazed me, even in the severest years when you knew a family's children were going without food, people needed cash for various things, and they made a choice to sell some of their precious grain to buy things. And so we found it's not sufficient just to reach self-sufficiency. And people, particularly with radio and these days internet and so on, mobile phones, people are aware of the wider world and they have greater aspirations.
Okay, thank you. Shona, do you want to come in on looking at production and distribution and consumption?
All right.
Or whatever else you might like to say.
Yes. We're talking about, I think we began this part of the session talking about what are the potential solutions to these issues. And I suppose that just got me thinking about what I mentioned earlier about examining the impacts of our diets on the environment. I suppose to add to Ronnie's earlier point, she said an imperfect apple or carrot costs the same to produce as a perfect one. It also costs the same amount of environmental resources. So, so food waste on one side and carbon-intensive and resource-intensive diets, I suppose, at the earlier end of the food chain. Two, I suppose, key intervention points where we can try to, they're easy, and excuse the pun, but they're low-hanging fruit, you know. So they're the things that we can probably address a bit earlier without having to drastically change our production systems, although that is necessary. But in terms of short-term action, that's actually probably something we can do. And the Australian government is, they're putting together a national waste strategy, food waste strategy, where they aim to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. So I think we really have to push them to really actually push for structural change in the system. Like Ronnie mentioned, the reason OzHarvest and organisations like that can operate is because of the massive waste in the system. And so we need to look at what ways we can reduce that. What can we do with that produce? Aside from feeding hungry people, I think even OzHarvest couldn't take all the food waste that was available in Australia. So what else can we do with it? Is it things like relaxing those crazy appearance standards? And it's about changing our perception of what food should look like and changing our expectations of what it is. It shouldn't be perfect. It's also about things like getting a better deal for the farmers, providing markets for them for substandard produce that maybe can't go through the supermarkets. Is there a way, I suppose that the loss of local processing facilities means that there's nowhere for this food to go. So that's one avenue. So there's a number of ways that, not just at the household level where we can reduce food waste. We worked out that 60% of all food waste actually happens earlier in the food chain. So we need to be looking at and focusing on the whole system rather than just, what's going off in your fridge and maybe you should meal plan a little bit more, which is an important thing to do, but we've also got to look at the bigger picture.
Thank you. Ronnie, you want to come in?
I guess I just want to say that when you talk about the cosmetic standards, the supermarkets only put on the shelves what we want to buy. So we can't say to the supermarkets, we can say, we can say we're willing to eat produce that doesn't look so beautiful. Until such time as we do that, the supermarkets will put on the shelves only the beautiful things that they think we want to buy. And that was the point I was trying to make earlier. Until such time as we act with our feet or act with our mouths, that's what's going to shift and change. But you're 100% right. Of course, that is only one very not small element. And what's in our fridge is a big element of food waste, but it's the whole food supply chain. It's everywhere along the food supply chain that the issue of waste occurs, and waste prevention. For us, from OzHarvest point of view, our goal is to put ourselves out of business, is to stop food waste and teach people how to live a sustainable life. And that is crucial for us.
And if you achieve that, how is that going to feed the world? Beyond the nation, beyond Australia, how is that then? What's the next step? Sorry, you want to come in?
So moving on just from food waste is another thing that we have explored is looking at different diets for Australia and modelling those and modelling the impact and modelling what we call direct food availability. So whether we can feed ourselves from within our borders. So we've got to think about Australia as just as one food bowl amongst a number of global food bowls, all of which have their own issues and own vulnerabilities. And so what we looked at, we modelled different diets, healthy diets. We modelled our current diet, which is not particularly healthy, and we looked at a diet with animal products and one without. And when we modelled this diet into the future, like up to 2060, we saw that if we continued to eat even the meat levels according to the healthy diet recommendations, by the time we got to about 2060, we would completely eat into all of our export capacity. So the way we could maintain export capacity was to actually change our diet to make it more plant-based, still healthy, but that way we could, I suppose, ensure our security in not just in food supply, but also contributing to economic security of our country.
But beyond Australia?
Yeah. And that would then give food to other countries. So things like in Australia, we produce a lot of beef, but we produce that beef on marginal land. Now, there's a question of whether it's best for us to produce that beef here, because that land can't be used to produce anything else, or should we not be producing it at all? But how will people in other countries, like in other countries, will it compete for land that could be used to grow crops? So there's a really interesting thing in what, I don't have the answer for this one, for what Australia should do with its beef. Do we keep producing it, and do we keep sort of copying the emissions that come with it in order to feed the world? Or do we stop it and then make other countries produce their own beef and possibly take up land that could be used to grow crops?
Well, Tony, what about that? I mean, cheap imports undermining indigenous agricultural systems.
So, yeah, not an expert on the whole export situation, but my experience, I'm convinced that even the poorest countries, particularly in Africa but elsewhere, are more than capable of growing sufficient food at this point in time, because what we're seeing, the level of production is below what's possible for that land if you're managing it in a sustainable way. And just through the promotion of natural regeneration of trees in Niger Republic, we kick-started a movement, if you like. It spread from farmer to farmer. And in 1984, average tree density on the agricultural land was less than 4 trees per hectare. And on many farms, no trees per hectare whatsoever. By the 1990s, average tree density reached 45 trees per hectare. And studies that have been done since then, we're starting, food production was at a very low base. People not using fertilizers, improved seed, or modern cultivation techniques. So they're only harvesting 300 to 400 kilos of grain per hectare. But that production doubled and in some cases tripled, and it's estimated because the regeneration spread to in excess of 5 million hectares, every year in Niger, without subsidy, without projects promoting it, people are producing an additional 500,000 tonnes of grain. So the land can produce much, much more than it is currently and sustainably.
Well, on that note, I wanted to come back to Herbert. I mean, what is the role of technology, of science, some of the research that you've been doing about new farming systems? What's the role of that in?
Well, it better be really large, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. I mean, the first thing I wanted to speak to, this undercurrent of a question, is what can Australia do? I mean, what difference would it make if we changed our lifestyles? Australia is ultimately, hate to be saying this, quite an irrelevant country in terms of the size of population. We're not, so if we all stopped eating beef and liberated whatever is now available in terms of primary production from Australia's agricultural fields and somehow imported that grain to African countries or to India, that wouldn't make a sizable difference. I think the biggest roles that Australians play in this game, there are two major functions, the way I see it. One is to lead by example. And what I mean by this is when you follow the statistics globally that I was alluding to at 2 earlier points, the per capita consumption of beef, of chicken, of veal, I mean, all the different sources of meat. The way this has tracked over time globally, and Australia is the meat-eating capital of the world, you look at developing countries. China is a good example, where we're currently sitting at around 40 to 45 kilograms of meat consumption per capita. You roll back 10 years, it was closer to 5. You go to China now, you find Kentucky Fried Chicken, you find Burger King and McDonald's. The lifestyle that Americans, that Canadians, that Australians practice is what's being followed in the developing countries. That's what I mean by leading by example. If we led by a different example, that it's not cool to go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, then it wouldn't occur in China. I'm an editor-in-chief for a journal, and one of the big things that I observed on day one, taking over as editor, is the amount of plagiarism that occurs from places like China. The copying of something that people in the yet developing nations perceive as ideal. You look at Australians and it's ideal. We have to follow this. So that's the one role, to lead by positive example. But the other, even bigger role, and I think Karen would agree with me on that one, is the role of science, the role of science and technology. Australia has an incredible responsibility on this front because we are such an educated country. The reason I came here from Canada is because University of Melbourne has an assemblage of scholars that just knocks your socks off. It really does. It certainly does in my discipline in the biological sciences. We have people working on pest resistance, improving vitamin A content and micronutrients in rice and things like that, right here in Melbourne. I mean, talk about a global reach. You know, I mean, golden rice is a famous example that people have heard about. To enrich the rice grain with provitamin A. There are more than 2.8 million children a year that are diagnosed with vitamin A deficiency in the developing world, and most of those die from malnutrition. We can address some of those issues with science and technology. And again, to summarize briefly that earlier fact, the yields of all the big crops on the planet that really do feed people have more than tripled over the last 50 years through research efforts, through science and through technology. So I think it's very important to recognize the role of science and technology in this, and in that rubric to recognize the extraordinary responsibility for a country with the resources, the human resources and the financial resources as Australia.
I mean, I just want to come in there before I open it up, because of course, the problem of overconsumption, we could actually learn quite a lot by the positive example of non-Western societies, rather than Australia and Canada leading. You know, there are lots of societies that don't overconsume and don't have the habits and lifestyle where they need a perfectly shaped banana or apple to buy in the supermarket. So I think it's the example isn't just one way. I mean, there's a sort of response. Maybe you do a lot of work on education and engagement.
Yeah, but I do just want to share, when you talk about role modelling, I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but OzHarvest in Sydney, we have just recently opened, and it's a total social experiment, and it is a free supermarket. So we deliver to over 1,000 charities, but we decided we would take some of that food, the surplus, beautiful, quality, good food, and put it in a supermarket environment and give it away for free, because we've collected it for free. It's been an extraordinary experiment. The notion is take what you need and give if you can. It's not pay what you think it's worth, and it's not evaluate what you've got in your basket. It's give if you can. So it is a free supermarket. In 8 weeks, we've had over 8 million responses and views from around the world. We've had 50 countries ask for us to take this model there. And this is just using surplus. So it's just an interesting thing how everybody, the world is so small these days, that everything anybody does is out there to be copied, the good and the bad.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's open up for questions, comments, thoughts. Okay, shall we take the one over here on the, 1, 2, and 1 at the back, and then we'll take another round.
Yes, thank you for your contributions. I'm looking at it somewhat more from a sociological standpoint, and I think it's important to have a look at world systems and how the world system functions. Now, incredible amounts of social wealth are spent on militarism. We have got wars going on, you know, billions of dollars. There's also incredible wastage in terms of land, because you have got, for instance, here in Melbourne or throughout Australia, a lot of agricultural land is being taken up by suburbia, a lot of good agricultural land. Therefore, you've got huge problems in terms of transporting food, which is very intensive in terms of energy use and so on and so forth. Now, I think what one has to have a look at is more radical solutions than we have today. And I think the radical solutions would involve questioning the kind of social systems that we have, which is basically capitalism. It's basically profit production. And I think we've got to rethink in terms of ecological sustainability and ecological egalitarianism. And it's a big project, of course, and it's very daunting, but I think we've got to start thinking about it. Otherwise, I can't see how humanity will continue in the next 40 or perhaps even less years.
Thank you. Okay, so radical solutions. The problem is capitalism and world systems. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rowan Mclaren. I used to work for the government of Rwanda for about 3 years. And I've got a couple of brief questions. I noticed that, just in the comparison between Rwanda and Australia, Rwanda is a very poor nation. Through landscape degradation, they've looked at doing agroforestry approaches to protect the ecological structure and function of the land, attract more rainfall, make the land more productive. When you're flying into Australia, a place like Melbourne, you fly in over expanses of fields where the trees have been taken out. You talk to the older generation, and the land in certain areas doesn't produce the same kind of thing anymore because this isn't done. And I suppose, like in Rwanda, a lot of these areas are on private land. And how do you incentivize people in Australia where you can't basically ask them to put trees in their land, and they might be able to cut down 1 or 2 trees in 10 years' time and make some money out of it because it's not worth it for us? So how do you encourage these people in Australia to return this ecological function to the land and to return that sort of way? One other thing, briefly, is that you're saying 40% of food is wasted in Australia. I think a solution to this is probably to empower people to provide entrepreneurial solutions to this. So how do we get transparency into what is being produced, where the wastage is, and how people can actually put their entrepreneurial mindset in the university or wherever to solve these issues and create businesses out of that and improve the economy?
Thank you very much. So incentivising, returning the ecological function of the land, and also thinking about the transparency around the food wastage. Yeah, we've got someone back there, yeah.
Thank you for the talk this evening. My name is Esther, and I'm from Nigeria originally, but have studied here as well as an agricultural scientist. The issue with developing countries, I'm going to take the case of Nigeria. The issue with lack of production of enough food is because in the Western societies encourage them to produce a lot of cash crops. Things like cocoa, peanuts, palm oil. So people abandon actually producing food for consumption to produce all these cash crops, which are exported to developed countries. And those crops are processed and then sent back to them to buy for a very large amount of money. So that's one issue. Secondly, in developed countries, agriculture is subsidized. So which means that people are allowed to hoard a lot of grains, hoard a lot of agricultural produce in order to maintain high price. And if they can't get the high price, they'll rather lose the crop instead of sending it to places where the food is required. So I think that really the world should look into that rather than just focusing on sending food to developing countries or just helping them out or giving them an example of how to survive, because they do know how to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so before we take the next round, a few questions, few issues raised. Don't feel that you have to address all of them. Shona, do you want to start?
I just want to address, what was the question, the second part of
transparency around
right.
and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think, is there a microphone?
Oh.
Sorry. I do have a loud voice, but probably not that loud. Look, I think transparency, I suppose what we've tried to do, since there wasn't, say, data on food waste, or not consistent data, because It's actually a fairly recent kind of issue. So there's a bit of, municipal waste data, and there's a bit of this, but, and so getting our hands on that data is really, really difficult, particularly because even just getting your hands on data on how much of the food produced on the outskirts of Melbourne actually comes in, like freight data, it's private data. So I suppose our way around that, to try to bring that kind of transparency and try to actually quantify the extent of the problem, is we took, I suppose, data from the FAO, which they estimated in countries like our region is North America and Oceania, so we're grouped in with the US in terms of our food waste practices. And we applied that to an Australian model we have. Called the Australian Stocks and Flows Framework, which kind of tracks all of the resources. Basically, it's a model of the entire physical economy of Australia. So we used kind of what we had. Like, it's not perfect, but just by at least trying to estimate what that was, then we start the conversation about solutions and ideas and entrepreneurship. I think the next stage is how is the federal government going to support that in their national food waste strategy? And I know that there's a few people kind of working on that and putting in ideas right now. So, yeah, I suppose if you have any ideas yourself, I'd write to Josh Frydenberg.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, we'll just let the others respond. We'll have drinks and food upstairs. So you can,
So perhaps just a little bit on the incentivisation. How do you get farmers to plant trees? Probably, I'm not an expert at this, but probably one of the most successful social experiments in Australia was the launching of land care by the Kerner government. And redneck farmers who perhaps would never think of the role of trees and the environment on their agricultural production were gathered together, a combination of government and farmers, to solve common problems. It might have been erosion gullies or rabbits or some other thing. And through that movement, it changed the landscape of many, many farms across Australia, and people did begin to see the value of trees. In developing countries, when I run a workshop, it's quite a battle, because there's a deeply held mindset that you can't have trees on your land. They'll compete with your crops, they'll shade them, and your crop yield will go down. And people are already living on the edge of hunger every year. What I try to convince them about is it's in your best interests and for the future of your children to have some level of trees on your landscape. Crop yields will increase and conditions will improve. And usually there's a number of steps required. Maybe you have to visit a farmer that's practicing that already. I show before and after slides, and we have long discussions, and then you might have program officers that visit regularly, encouraging and walking alongside the farmers as they go on that path.
thank you. Ron.
I think one of the things that's very clear in Australia that we have to do is get some kind of a base measure. We talk about $20 billion worth of food going to waste every year in Australia. 10 billion households and consumers and 10 billion industry. But in fact, those figures have been drawn from all sorts of sources. And so part of what our role, and I say our as in OzHarvest, since we got our government to actually commit to the 2030 goal of halving food waste, is saying we need to create some kind of organization, independent organization, that one will do the measure, and then two, a voluntary agreement that we can get business, all levels of the food supply chain involved in it, to understand and to create the framework and mapping how we're going to achieve that goal. So the 1 in 5 supermarket bags has come from research that was done 10 years ago. So we're working on research that is a little, it's what we've got, it's the best that we've got, but isn't OzHarvest on its, I can tell you exactly what we collect, every bit of food that we collect, whether it's milk, dairy, fruit, vegetables gets noted. So every donor gets a full detailed report on what it is they have wasted that month. We've made thousands of businesses more efficient.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I want to speak to the points on incentivization and de-incentivization. How do you get people to do the right thing from the small to the big? I mean, one of the things, for example, that stunned me when I came to Melbourne was the obsession with coffee, and I'm a big coffee fan as well. But when you look at it a bit more critically, you observe the following. Most Melburnians consume their coffee on an espresso base and milk based. Most. Yeah, there's the long black and there's the pure espresso, but most of them, the flat white and so on and so forth, are all milk based. Now you watch the baristas make that coffee, watch them carefully, and they give you a whole speech about it, how it's got to be done right with the real texture and how the temperature has to be just so. It's really quite an art, so they say. And then you watch what happens to the rest of the milk that was just added to the cup of milk. It goes down the drain. And again, they have a whole lecture about this because it can't be used again because the texture and the temperature isn't right anymore. If you totaled up just that, just the milk that's thrown into the drain from Melburnians consuming coffee every single day, you would be in utter shock what resource wastage occurs just on the basis of a very simple habit that most of us enjoy but don't actually think all the way through. We're not de-incentivizing that kind of waste. But on a much larger level, subsidies, incentives are incredibly important. The meat-consuming habit. In the developing world, the OECD countries subsidize beef and veal, just those two, to the tune of $18 billion a year. $18 billion a year. To an ecologist, when you look at the efficiency of a cow to convert what it's eating, the primary plant products that it's eating, and the meat or the milk that it makes out of that food, a cow is an incredibly inefficient convergence machine. There are the efficiencies that we call assimilation efficiency, production efficiency, consumption efficiency. Cut a long story short, you lose 95% of all the energy that cow has eaten. You only get 5% out of it. So to the extent that we're consuming milk or that we're eating the beef, we have just wasted 95% of all the caloric intake that would have been available for direct consumption by humans. We're not incentivizing it because the subsidies are going exactly the opposite way. If you had to pay for that ratio, for the fact that you've just wasted 95% of the calories at the checkout in the supermarket, you wouldn't be buying any meat. You would not be doing it. Let me give you another example, if I go a bit over time here. The corn harvest in the United States. Corn harvest. Corn, one of the biggest crops on the planet. You'd think it's, of course, eaten by humans for the most part. No, it's not. It turns out only, get this number, 1.84% of the United States corn harvest is directly consumed by humans in the form of popcorn or corn cobs. 1.8, under 2%. The subsidy structure is such that by law, since George Bush Jr., 40% of the corn harvest in the United States has to go to biofuel production. We're making fuel out of food under subsidy. And any farmer who doesn't is an idiot because they're not being paid the money they could be paid for the corn that they're producing in their field. 40%. Another 40% goes directly to animal feed, coming back to that subsidy of beef and veal that I was just talking about. So 80% of all the corn you see in the agricultural fields throughout the United States and Canada goes to two things that have nothing to do with feeding people directly, or at least awfully inefficiently. Remember the 95%? It's animal feed and biofuels. Giving you one statistic on how many livestock animals we have on the planet, 27 billion livestock animals are reared by humans. 1.4 billion cows, 1 billion sheep, 1 billion goats. Give you an idea. It's not just 7.5 billion people, it's 27 billion livestock animals. And it's the subsidy systems, the economic systems, that make that possible. If we priced it differently, the outcome would be different.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we haven't responded to the issue about the unequal and uneven global economy but maybe we'll come back to that. I think we've got time just for another quick round of questions and quick responses from the panelists. So I think there was one. I'm just trying to spread it out a bit here. Someone I'm not. Okay. 2, and at the back there, yeah. 3. Sorry. 2, yes. And 3 at the back, just behind.
Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chuan. I'm studying computer science as undergraduate student. I came and attend this discussion not because my course is directly related to food security, but because I'm a human and I do need to eat. And it truly okay. Before I ask any questions, can I do a quick survey? Those who are vegetarian in this room, could you put your hand up? Yes, do include vegans. Those of you who have your hand up, who have had no trouble at all finding vegetarian food, please put your hand down. Like no trouble at all of finding vegetarian food, or finding it a bit too costly than usual.
It didn't work because it didn't explain the rules first. Explain them again.
Well, those who find, put your hand down if you find, well, put your hand up if you find being vegetarian is a bit more costly, both in time and money. Because I did a little bit of calculations that the organic food, lentils, in order to have 1 kg of lentils supplies 3 grams of proteins, and 1 kg of chicken supplies around 30. So in order to match up the balance, I need to pay $12 on organic lentils. And this doesn't mean that lentils are essentially more expensive than chicken, the meat. But I feel like it's the tag of something being organic that's pushing the price up. So my question is this notion of something being organic, not vegetarian, but the idea of something being organic that's destroying this change of vegetarianism? Because many people turn away from buying something organic just because it's been more expensive.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Ariel. I founded a social enterprise that encourages urban gardening. And my question is about what impact do you think will be advertising regarding that overconsumption? Because I think the doctor talked about China copying our lifestyles. And I think that they get our lifestyles from advertising, from multinationals' advertisements showing that eating this or that is really cool. And I would like to know if there's any action regarding that, about changing advertising or something, changing multinationals. And as well, I think that the supermarkets and all kind of shops that you see in the high street, they're kind of going away with producing as much waste as they can. And it seems that legislation, there could be like a legislation not giving incentive, but fining them for the amount of waste that they're producing. I think that will be a better motivation than giving an incentive, a positive incentive rather than giving a negative incentive rather than a positive one regarding the production of the waste. Thank you.
Thank you. And just behind you, yeah.
I guess this is more from a science perspective, but we learn a lot about GMOs and food that, and you were talking about food that is enriched, and I was just wondering, is there a sustainable and, I guess, economically sustainable way that we can encourage diversity while also keeping up that level of production? And like the woman from Nigeria talked about how they focus on cash crops, can we bring back indigenous and local crops at a level that could feed the world?
Okay, thanks. So, brief, we're running out of time, but brief responses. Do you want to start?
Maybe just a comment on the Nigerian ladies. So I don't have the answer, but I agree with you fully. And I didn't realise until I joined World Vision that eating a can of pineapples was a tool of oppression. And what I mean by that, I visited Kenya regularly when I first joined World Vision, and there were communities in the dry zone who regularly suffered from food shortages. In this particular community, we're working on a pineapple plantation on the best land with access to irrigation over thousands of hectares. Even their children weren't in school, they were earning just a few shillings a day, helping their parents to put food on the plate. It's just so unfair. And growing up here, totally oblivious, totally unaware of the injustice of what I was doing, innocently buying things. So I agree, I don't know the solution. Economics, power, even your own country's own governments see this as the way of the future for earning export earnings. So it's a very complex issue.
But there was one specific question about the role of science and technology in the sense of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. This is probably one of the hottest issues for scientists to answer to. What is the potential of the technology? What are its dangers? Most experts in this arena who are looking at the numbers with cold hard facts will conclude that we do require everything we've got in our toolbox of science to ensure food security in the years to come. And this does include some applications of genetic modification, in particular those that produce crops that are more pest resistant, crops that might have higher nutrient content, crops that might be more resistant to salt stress, water shortages, these kinds of things. I think we cannot get around using technologies of that modern sort to help us in this fight. But those of you who are more concerned about potential negatives in this should rest relatively easily. Every single study that has been done on this front from the scientific arena, and there are a lot of them, all come to the same conclusion that there is no health risk from genetic modification of crop organisms that one has to be afraid of, whether that's the conclusion of the American Medical Association or the American Association for the Advancement of Science or the National Academy of Science. I'm not one who will push genetic modification as that panacea at all, but I do think we need to include it in our arsenal. What I'm afraid about as a scientist, this comes back to the subsidies in the financial and social systems, is the exact same thing that we're observing in the medical field. When intellectual property is owned by big corporations, that then the availability to those poor farmers that need the technology the most is what we need to think about from the get-go. If we cannot enable it, why are we investing in that technology? But there are quite a few positive examples. In fact, the golden rice technology is one of them that has finally left the grubby hands of the multinationals and has moved towards the not-for-profit International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines that was founded back in 1960 on that very premise that we needed to have a not-for-profit approach to the world's largest crop species that feeds more people than any other. So I'm encouraged by that knowledge transfer into the public domain. It is possible, and we need to follow those examples that we've also seen in the medical domain. Making available medications against malaria or HIV medications to those parts of the world that cannot otherwise afford those medications based on their income levels.
Okay, thank you. Did you remember what you wanted to show that?
I suppose I kind of want to reply to what Herbert has said there. And he talked about, science being our toolbox. I think we have to, if we want to feed the world, we have to extend our toolbox. Science is great and fantastic, but it's feeding people. You know, science exists within a society. Science exists to serve a society. So if we want to feed the world, it's all very well to say, oh, let's give everyone their golden rice and it's like, you know, all that, and that's great. But do people want to eat the golden rice? Do they want to get their vitamin A from golden rice? We need to draw on the successes of programs like Landcare that we mentioned earlier that have brought all the stakeholders together. So if we just are very, very science-centric, you know, it's sort of, it's at risk of becoming kind of another form of cultural imperialism. So I think science is one part, maybe GMOs is one part, agroecology is one part. If we want to improve the sustainability and resilience of our food system, we have to embrace diversity and we have to include people. And so we have to bring people along for the ride. Science alone is great, but it's not going to do it on its own.
We're running out of time. I was going to ask all of you, just, you know, we've got a large number of people in the audience here. I mean, they're going to go home tonight and have something to eat, or go out to eat. I mean, what's the one thing, maybe I'll start with you, Ronnie, what's the one thing that you think people leaving here today could do to make a difference?
Absolutely. When you go shopping, make a list. Look what's in your fridge before you go shopping. Look what's in your pantry before you go shopping. And start really taking responsibility and being aware of not buying 2-for-1 lettuce, 2-for-1 broccoli. The chances are that you don't eat the second one. So really, really planning and thinking about your food choices. Obviously, buying local, supporting local farmers, but really being aware of your effect on your shopping.
Thank you. Do you have a take-home message? A very short take-home
Very
message.
short. Twofold. One, become a vegetarian immediately, starting tonight. And number two, yes, do become a scientist.
I think I agree with Ronnie in terms of what can we do as Australians. Know where your food comes from and make buying choices accordingly. And perhaps one additional thing, the situation is not hopeless. There's just so many solutions out there and we see positive things all the time. So please don't go away discouraged and feeling we're all doomed, but there's work to do.
Individual action is great, but I want you all to organise yourselves. Okay, food security is a collective problem and it requires a collective solution. So yeah, get together and let's get together and figure it out.
Action is if you can all join me in thanking the panellists.